When you picture evolution, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably the slow, steady, continuous line of change, right? But what if I told you the real story is way more dramatic, more stop and start? Today, we're diving into punctuated equilibria, a truly revolutionary idea that completely flipped our understanding of the rhythm of life's history. Okay, let's get into it.
So, the big question is evolution really the slow and steady tortoise we all learned about in school? I mean, for a very long time, that was the accepted wisdom. But here's the thing, the fossils themselves, they were starting to tell a very, very different story. And this is where you can see the massive disconnect. On the one hand, you have the expected pattern, this nice, smooth, gradual ramp of change. It makes sense, it feels logical. But then you look at what paleontologists were actually digging out of the ground. Species just pop into existence in the fossil record, stay pretty much the same for millions of years, and then just vanish. It wasn't a ramp at all. It was more like a series of steps with these really, really long landings. Now, to really get why this was such a huge deal, we need to rewind a little and look at the old view, and the really stubborn problem it was creating for scientists. In this old view, it has a fancy name, phyletic gradualism. This was the classic textbook Darwinian model. The whole idea was that an entire species slowly and steadily transforms into a new one over immense stretches of time. You can kind of picture the whole population just marching in lockstep towards a new form. So here's the problem. If gradualism was the rule, then the fossil record should be absolutely jam-packed with all those in-between forms, right? But it wasn't. And for more than a century, scientists just kind of shrugged and said the record was incomplete. It was full of gaps. The evidence, they figured, just hadn't been found. But then came the 1960s and 70s, and with them, a totally revolutionary idea from a couple of young scientists who had the guts to question, well, everything. You have to remember, this wasn't happening in a vacuum. Society was in upheaval, and that question authority vibe was spilling over into science. A new generation of paleontologists wasn't happy with just describing and cataloging dusty old bones. They wanted to tackle the big questions, and they came armed with new ideas from biology, a healthy dose of skepticism, and they were ready to shake things up. So the groundwork was already being laid. Way back in 1942, the biologist Ernst Mayr figured out that new species usually form in small, isolated groups, away from the main population. Then, fast forward to the 60s, and these two grad students, Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould, start connecting Mayr's idea to that gappy fossil record. And in 1972, they dropped an absolute bombshell of a paper. They called their idea punctuated equilibria. And it's actually pretty simple, but totally profound. They argued that for most of a species' existence, it's in a state of equilibrium, or what they called stasis. These are long, stable periods with very little change. But then, those long, stable periods are punctuated by these quick, geologically rapid bursts of change where new species branch off. Okay, so let's put these two models side by side. Because the best way, by far, to think about this is to picture a ramp versus a staircase. Let's just break it down. Under gradualism, the entire population slowly transforms. The pace is slow and steady. And the fossil record should show a long, smooth sequence of all those intermediate fossils. But under punctuated equilibria, a small, isolated group splits off. The pace is a rapid burst, followed by a long, long period of stability. So what does the fossil record show? Exactly what we see. The sudden appearance of new species, and then millions of years of pretty much nothing happening. Stasis. And that's our central analogy right there. It's really the clearest way to visualize these two competing ideas. One is a gentle, unending slope of change. The other is a series of sharp rises and long, flat steps. So with the gradualism model, you've got change happening all the time in these tiny, almost invisible little steps. It just slowly, and I mean slowly, adds up over millions of years until voila, you have a new species. But the PE model, it starts somewhere completely different. It starts with these incredibly long periods of stability. We're talking millions of years where a species' basic blueprint is remarkably stable. And this is that key concept, stasis. And then bam, A punctuation event. Now, geologically speaking, this happens in an instant. A small, isolated population goes through this period of rapid change, a new species is born, and it spreads out. And that so-called gap in the fossil record, it's not a gap at all. It's the record of a real, super fast event. As you can probably imagine, this idea didn't exactly go over quietly. It triggered an absolutely intense scientific showdown. I mean, seriously, forget any stereotype you have of the quiet, dusty scientist hunched over some bones. The atmosphere at paleontology meetings became electric. People were passionate. There were heated arguments, people literally shouting at each other across the room. This wasn't just some polite academic disagreement. This was a fundamental fight over how to read the entire history of life on Earth. And at the very heart of it all was this simple, powerful phrase. The most important argument Eldredge and Gould made was that the lack of change, the stasis, wasn't just missing information. No, stasis was the data. It was the most common, dominant pattern in the fossil record, and it needed to be explained, not explained away as an imperfection.
So, how impactful was this idea? Well, by 2025, that original 1972 paper had been cited this many times. Over 7,500. In the academic world, that's not just influential, that's legendary. That makes it one of the most important papers in the entire history of paleontology. So, okay, it shook up the world of fossils, but why should you and I care? What is the lasting legacy of punctuated equilibria?
Well, the impacts were huge. For one, it challenged the neat and tidy idea that the big patterns of evolution, what we call macroevolution, are just the small, everyday changes of microevolution added up over time. It introduced new concepts like species selection to explain major trends. It also led to this idea of coordinated stasis, suggesting that entire ecosystems might stay stable for long stretches and then get reshuffled all at once by major environmental events. And maybe most importantly, it brought paleontologists and their fossils back to the high table of evolution, bridging the gap between their world and the world of biologists studying life today. Which brings us to a final, pretty provocative question. If this theory is right, and these rapid evolutionary bursts are often kicked off by major environmental stress and disruption, well, you just have to look around at our world today, and it really makes you wonder. Are we living in one of those long, boring periods of stasis, or are we, right now, setting the stage for the next great punctuation in the history of life?